Today's program is come about because of all that's happening in the world around us. The protests, the rallies, the kind of dawning of change that is so past due, but so important. And as a part of that, we were not just impassioned to be a part of that change, but felt that we could really have a voice in supporting the world at large by supporting you as employers and leaders to bring change to the workforce. So it didn't stop with one person going on a march and being a part of it, but by many people being a part of it together. And that was a large part of where we wanted to bring change and why Therese and I are joining you today. Therese, did you have any other comments on that jumping in?
No, the only thing that I would add is that I certainly think that everyone on this call can certainly catch their breath and applaud themselves for being on this call. You definitely deserve abundance of credit for being having the foresight to recognize the need for this. So we appreciate that you are moving forward with us.
Great. And I could not echo that more perfectly, so thank you. Let's go over the agenda. Before I do, tell you a tiny bit about our company. Are you ready to be dynamic? Because developing and maintaining a healthy, productive workplace is indelibly tied to the relations between your teams and your leaders. At Dynamic Team Solutions, we know the value of a collaborative team, and we excel in creating those customized solutions that address the specific needs of you, your team, your organization. Our talented and diverse team are experts. We resolve issues of communication, teamwork, leadership, workplace conflict, and we know it's great when your employees want to come to work, but it becomes dynamic when they want to work with each other. And that's even more true today when we're all working remotely. And it doesn't become necessary to work in the same physical capacity, but we certainly need to want to work in the same collaborative capacity. So, Therese, why don't you kick it off?
Okay. As we look at this photo, we see a group of people who are protesting. It looks like a non-violent protest. It looks like people are expressing their feelings about police brutality, racism, and all of the ills that have brought us here today. People are concerned. They are trying to impact a change. They're ready to have those difficult conversations and move the needle so that we're no longer stuck where we've been. And the question is, where are we? We're at a point where people are feeling like they are either stuck or they are in a position where they're so angry they don't know what to do. People are trying to figure out how to move forward, where are we and what we're doing. And when I look at the question about why we're here, I heard something the other day that really kind of makes a lot of sense to me. And that is that history does not repeat itself. People repeat history. And what's happened is the concerned and the level of concern that we're seeing is the results of people repeating the history, repeating the ills over and over, and everyone getting to that point where they're saying, can't do this anymore. We have to do it differently.
Very true. And I think, why we're here, and this goes back to what we said as we were beginning the program, is that we all feel, any of us on this call, a passion and a commitment to create change. It is so long overdue. We want to be a part of a solution. I know that's why you're joining us today. You want to be able to know how to be involved and how to help. And that's something we hope to share with you today. And I think there's a big part where we're moving, and we have now some vernacular that helps us with this, from a place of being non-racist and of, holding on to our own values and being very clear that we aren't going to treat people with differentiation based on the color of their skin or their orientation in any way, shape, or form. But now we have a new term that's become really in the forefront of our awareness, and that's anti-racist, taking the actual stance of making change beyond ourselves, not just taking responsibility for ourselves, but for the greater change that needs to happen. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here.
The one other point that I would add is as we struggle to move forward, we want to respectfully recognize that there are people that are on both sides of the issue. There are people who definitely see this need for change, as well as people who don't see, that can't tell what's wrong, don't know what's wrong. So that means as we begin to communicate with each other, that we have to be respectful of the different positions that people are coming from. So, but this is certainly something that has to happen, and no doubt that we can do it.
All right, so let me jump into the agenda. What are we going to cover today? First, preparation. In other words, what are you, after this call, after this webinar, what are you going to do first? And that is to become prepared. And I'll go over some of the steps that you need to do before you initiate that facilitative session so that you are ready for it and are able to handle it well. Then we're going to jump into the actual steps of how to initiate that session. What will it contain in terms of content, how to facilitate it, and how to end and close up that session, as well as providing follow-up. We want to make sure you feel really ready to make change and to be able to lead this in a really productive, powerful way. So first, the preparation. What is part of that preparation? And the first part is identifying your why. Why are you doing it? You know, being incredibly crystal clear of why you want to do that. Just as Teresa and I expressed our interest in doing this program to bring forth further change, you need to identify that. Why as a company are you doing it? Is it to support your employees? Is it because you want to be part of a greater change? Any of those are going to be very important to your employees in understanding why you care as individuals, why you care as a company. Is it something that is just your own pet project, or is the whole organization behind it? All of these are going to be what helps to build engagement with your employees. You want them to know why it matters to you. You want to be aware as well about the core values. What are the core values of the organization? Again, those of you as an individual. Sharing those and being able to articulate them clearly are going to really help you once you're in the middle of that facilitative session and people either don't show buy-in or seem resistant or less present than you want them to be. Getting to the core values is going to be very helpful in moving that forward. You want to know what the current commitments are. And that might be to say, right now we are maintaining our policy of hiring with diversity in mind and promoting with that in mind. But it might also be in today's current climate, we're contributing to these political campaigns or these social issues, or we're paying for people to be to volunteer or to rally and go to protest engagements. Let your mind flow about what you're currently doing so that you can speak to those commitments and let your employees know definitively what is being done. Knowing those are really important. And the key point here is your employees are impacted. So when you're explaining why you're doing this, let them know that they have feelings. Those are going to spill into the workplace, and you want them to have a way to use that for positive response rather than negative. That you want to make sure that this doesn't polarize them but unifies them. And that's a really important thing to offer them as a reason that you're doing it, but also a reason why you want them to invest in the process with you when you're facilitating the meeting. And finally, some considerations for conducting the meeting. Some things you want to think about are, how many sessions do you want to have? Do you want it to be a giant town hall or smaller ones where people can more openly share? I'm going to put in a vote, do the smaller ones. It's going to be more helpful. But then you need to consider who will lead them. Will each manager lead their own? Will it be a couple of people that are designated as leaders of this effort? Those are going to be considerations that'll vary company by company. One thing I want to reference is in doing today's program, I spoke with Therese about it when I, got the invigorating idea to do this. And I told her, I said, I think you'll be a fantastic co-presenter. But in all honesty, I also think your being an African American woman is going to make this more palatable and more approachable to a lot of people. And I really want that to be something that has deep reach. So I was very honest and transparent. I also asked her opinion about whether any of my ideas or thoughts were offensive. And I wore my heart on my sleeve, which hopefully I'm, not wrong in doing so. And I encourage that from you as well. Be really transparent about your motivations, especially because if you're on this today, I know your motivations for this are positive and you're looking to create good and change. So be very open about that. A final thought on considerations for conducting the meeting. When will you do it? And when might be, a transitional thing for everyone, but I want to point out 2 days from now is Juneteenth. This is something I admittedly only knew about maybe the last 5 years, but it is the representative holiday, if you will, of the end of slavery and the freedom of African Americans from that part of their history. And while it still represents itself in many places in today's society, Juneteenth is a very special day. And perhaps that's a day that if you have the wherewithal to either kick off these kind of programs or to announce it to your staff, that might be a very memorable and positive way to do so. So other things to think about and consider. Let's jump into the meeting part itself and what to do.
So as you're initiating this meeting, the first thing you probably want to consider is when you get people in the room, everyone is feeling uneasy. A way to kind of reduce their anxiety is to just begin by thanking them for showing up. The other thing you want to do is to share the agenda so people aren't sitting there feeling uneasy about, okay, I'm here, now what? If people have a clear picture about what that agenda is going to look like, and also letting people know that there is some flexibility in what gets discussed. And
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So as you share the agenda, that's your opportunity to get the buy-in from the participants. You want them to know what's going to be in this meeting. And so people can, and you'll probably see people nod and go, okay, yes, that's what I need to talk about. Okay, I'm here. I get it. They get it. Okay, now what? The next thing that you want to consider is to do an icebreaker. Now, an icebreaker can be done in two different ways. One way to do an icebreaker is to maybe tell a personal story, a story that give an example of something that you have experienced that maybe was eye-opening for you in terms of racism, if by chance you had not felt it and experienced it the way it's being described and experienced today. There may have been something along the way that you've experienced or someone in your family has experienced that you're comfortable sharing. Another icebreaker is to be able to ask questions that will allow you to take the temperature of the room. In other words, how are you feeling? By a show of hands, can I find out how many people are feeling nervous? How many people are angry? How many people are just confused? And as a facilitator, I've often done these icebreakers with the questions and actually raised my own hand. For example, if I say nervous, because I think sometimes it's good for the participants to know that, yes, you're the facilitator, but you're nervous too. You're feeling some anxiety. And so as people look around the room and see other people's hands go up when those questions are asked, then they kind of give themselves permission to feel angry, confused, or whatever it is that people are feeling. The other thing, as the facilitator, when you notice people's hands going up, for example, when you ask if people are angry, you want to make a note of that, because when people are approach someone who has raised their hand and they've indicated that they're angry, you want to keep that in mind. You will more than likely approach them slightly differently than you would approach someone who just said, I'm confused. So as the facilitator, you're going to want to make sure that you are watching how people react and respond to the questions that you ask.
And I'd like to just jump in a bit more on that same purpose. I think, there's a lot of icebreaker activities that people will do that are very rote ones. And I think the one Therese mentions is incredibly purposeful because you want everybody in the room to know how the rest of the room is feeling. And by asking them directly about their feelings and giving time for each of those questions to sit with them as they raise their hands and look around the room and see who has also raised their hand, it allows them to know they're not alone. It ensures that they are present and feeling engaged in the meeting. And it really creates a really safe space for people to be who they are and say what they need to say, which is what will be coming up as we move forward. One other thought, as the facilitator, you might want to make sure that you're making a lot of eye contact with those that raise their hands and nod, just nod as an acceptance that it's okay to be sad, to be angry, to be afraid, because those are all really normal feelings with what's going on, regardless of your race, regardless of your position in the situation.
Yeah, one other question that I thought might also be helpful is, are you in pain? Are you feeling pain? Is this painful for you?
I like that. That's great.
So as we move to our next slide, sensitivity to racial biases, and all of these signs are an excellent reflection of some things that sometimes happen unbeknownst to us. Any one of us could be guilty of one of these, missing the mark on that's reflected in one of these signs. You want to look at, make sure you talk about what the current efforts are in the company. What is the company doing in terms of racial sensitivity? Has anyone echoed those words? Does racial bias ever become part of the conversation? And maybe this is the first time as an organization, a company, that you're being brave enough to even echo these words, and that's okay. What will you be doing to ensure that the racial biases, if there are any in the company, number one, that they are acknowledged and that there is an action plan to move away from that? If in fact some of that is going on in the company, it by no means is an indication that anyone is bad or anything. It just means some of us are a little slower getting it. So you're here on this call, you get it. When you show up as a facilitator at a meeting, you're saying, we're not perfect yet, but we're aware. And what are the current efforts? What will it look like? What will you be doing to move the company forward? Will you be checking what your hiring policies look like? Will you be talking about what the promotional policies look like? And maybe also making sure that you get input from the participants, because you as an organization may very well feel that you've crossed all the T's, you've dotted all your I's, you've got this, but you want to be able to hear back from the participants. What else matters? What are we missing? What else do you need? And be able to create that space where they feel comfortable echoing whatever it is that they need.
Therese, I recall when we were talking about this, you shared a great anecdote, and I think it would fit so well here. Would you mind sharing it?
Yes, I did an employment mediation years ago, and it involved an employee who had gone to the HR department over a period of a couple years, complaining that her coworkers were constantly teasing her, relentlessly teasing her. And of course, HR did what happens sometimes in HR. They, wrote it up and everything. And the problem, and of course, this ended up in a mediation, and it wasn't until the mediation occurred were the people able to see what was going on. What had happened is the employees were teasing her and calling her a Dalmatian. Now, management was at the mediation table and they were saying, well, yeah, so they're teasing you, they're calling you a dog. What's the big deal? You know you're not a dog, get over it. And in a separate meeting, which we call a caucus, I was able to check in with the employee and find out what I had suspected was that she was biracial. So because she was biracial, the idea of being called a Dalmatian, white background with black spots, was very painful for her. She also also shared with me in the caucus that she was struggling with her identity as being biracial. So what was happening is something that was painful and that she was struggling with, someone else was making a joke of it and making the pain even worse. So I explained to her the only way she was going to be able to get the support from management that she needed and to get this to stop was that she would need to explain to management why this was painful. But what she explained is that she didn't feel like she should have to explain it. It was obvious. It was obvious to her. It was obvious to me, but it was not obvious to management. So it was not until I helped her have a conversation with management and explain the why behind that pain. And then she got the empathy and understanding that she needed from management. So in other words, that's an example of what can happen when people don't know, they don't get it, they don't understand. So that's why being able to have conversations is so important, because she was expecting them to respond to something they were totally oblivious to. And for her, because she'd been explaining it her entire life, it felt unnecessary and it felt like a burden to continue to explain what she felt was so obvious.
Yeah, it really does paint the picture of why it's so important that we allow this to be a really fluid conversation that you do in your internal workplace and invite people to share what else matters, what matters to them. Because even on the broad scale of things involving race and respect and equality and justice and fair treatment and all of that, you might miss things that are just not as obvious to you as they are to someone else in the room. So identifying those efforts that are needed is going to be very important as a part of your session.
And may I add one other thing, is maybe asking if someone's expressing pain about something, then maybe being able to ask them what makes that painful. In other words, getting underneath that pain, asking the why behind it will create a conversation that allows people to share what you need to know.
Right. In creating a respectful environment, which is going to be super important, this isn't just creating a respectful environment in the session. What I'm talking about on this slide is creating a respectful environment in the workplace going forward, because there's a very big difference between being nice and being honest for a lot of people. And I had a conversation with a woman who's a good friend of mine, and she happens to be African American, and she was telling me that, when we talked about this particular program, that the issue is not just white on black or any two ethnicities. She says there's a lot of black on black. There's a lot of racial bias and prejudice within the black community of its own, light skinned versus dark skinned and so forth. And so we were talking about that, and she was describing as well that, there's this discomfort. She has it even among her own family about speaking up, and that it isn't just a Caucasian person's fear about speaking up. It's within their own community. And that as a result, she chooses to not make anybody uncomfortable. And therefore, she also is not uncomfortable herself. And that's the challenge. And I've seen this outside of there being racial issues, that it has an impact on how people provide feedback to one another in an employment setting. Of course, that's especially vital, on what level of direct communication they have. Because if you're afraid of telling someone the truth, they can't improve. If you can't directly tell them, you're not good at this, or you need to do better, and bravely say it. Or you come across in a way that's very angry and argumentative, and it's causing us to miss your point. That kind of feedback is honest, and it can come out with kindness. So it's about creating a plan where you have that respectful environment going forward, where people can be brave in the way they communicate and really get their message across.
Yeah, I would add that ultimately what this is about is having difficult conversations, learning how to have difficult conversations in a way that allows you to move things forward, keeping in mind that sometimes it may get a little worse before it gets better, but that's okay. Be willing to do the work. The other thing is that oftentimes people, I've heard people say, do I sound mean when I say what I mean? And that's an example of how it gets difficult sometimes to say what we're feeling. So just know that you may not get it right. You may say what you need to say. Be willing to ask for a do-over if you need it.
And part of your facilitative session, after you bring up the importance of that respectful environment, and that being nice versus being honest is one key point of it, but there might be others that you come up with, is to have the conversation, to broach with those in session. How do we get past this? How do we make it okay to say things that you need to say, to express discomfort with the conversation, but still have it? And embrace that as part of the dialogue of the session, that there's a conversation that needs to happen about how to move past racial issues, issues of equality, issues of respect, issues of bias. How do we get past it? How do we communicate in a respectful way? And of course, invite them to share direct stories, just as Therese and I are sharing. It is a big part of learning for each person to hear another one's experience or perspective.
Right. In other words, good intentions come with risk.
Right, right. Therese, do you want to jump in on some steps
Okay,
for
how do you
closing up the meeting?
right, how do you close the meeting? As a facilitator, you want to make sure that you make some kind of commitments, because people will be sitting there going, okay, we did this, now what? So outline some commitments. And I think if you can make that a collaborative effort, it will go a long way. In other words, what forthcoming changes can people expect to see as a result of today's meeting? And it may very well be that you talk about short-term goals and maybe look at some long-term goals. In other words, everything can't be done in one day, but you can create maybe a timeline of sorts. Within the next 2 weeks, we can do A, B, and C. X, Y, and Z, it may take us a year. Within the year, we can get to those, but so that people have some idea what's going to happen. The ideal of circling back, will there be a follow-up meeting? And if so, when? Will there be any small group meetings going forward where maybe people will break into committees and say, okay, we're going to handle, or we'll review practices regarding promotions and get back to people. So there are all kinds of ways that you can make this work in your organization. And then please don't end the meeting without asking, are there other issues that we need to address? Because even as the facilitator, you may very well have, you may feel like you've covered all the issues, but you won't know unless you ask that question. So please remember to ask people, is there anything else that we're missing? And always, always close the meeting the same way that you began, with gratitude, thanking people, number one, for their presence, thanking them for being candid, thanking them for their patience with the process.
And I would add, I think this is a fantastic opportunity to also have your attendees, the participants in this session that you lead, express their own gratitude. They don't all need to, but it's a great way to give them a voice to closing it up. Especially if you have somebody who was sad at the start, they may say that they feel more empowered. If they have someone who feels angry, they might say they feel more connected with their team. And that will make everyone feel that pride in having participated, but also the momentum of what change is possible. And to make sure that you're wrapping it up in the way you want, save your own gratitude for the closing if you can, or add to it as a part of their having shared their own gratitude.
Yeah, another thing that could also be helpful is, as a facilitator, for example, if in the beginning, if I ask who felt nervous, and if I, as the facilitator, raised my hand, and then here we are at the closing of the meeting, I can ask that same question, is anyone still feeling nervous? And I can respond and say, I did feel nervous at the beginning of this, but I feel good. Given all the input that I've received, I feel confident that we can do this. That's kind of a nice way to maybe put a bow on it.
Right. Very true. So what is your work after the meeting? Much as there was the preparation before the meeting, there's some really important things that need to happen after the meeting. And one of the biggest ones is to make sure you know who's going to be responsible. If you have a diversity and inclusion person on your employment group, definitely they're the right person. They should be the one championing this issue. But if not, figure out who will be that designated champion. It might be that you have each manager lead their own group and each manager be available for their teams, their groups to report back to and to share progress or concerns or new issues. And those are all very important things, but that manager or person who's getting that feedback also needs to know who to send it to. There needs to be a collective body that can attend to that information and make sure that the company as a whole is staying collaborative in the effort to address issues. Clarify when people, with your own group that's forming this facilitative process, what is going to happen and when is it going to happen with regard to the feedback you received, with regard to the action items that the employees brought forth in the session and that seem like they are ones that can happen. It's more important that you follow up and do what you say you will do than even having the meeting. If you were to have this facilitative session and get people's feedback and do nothing with it, it will do more harm than good. They need to know that their investment emotionally and intellectually had teeth. It mattered to you, that you took steps to address the things that they brought forward, and that you weren't, just doing some virtue signaling by having the meeting to begin with. You want to make sure that you're really responsive. And part of that also means you circle back. You circle back if you can't do it quickly. You circle back with the timelines, the intentions, the efforts. You keep the people that share their ideas completely informed. And since this hopefully will be something you do across your company, include everybody in that information. It may be easier to do that by a team or group email, and that's fine. But it should also be one that allows responsiveness so that the employees stay engaged in this effort. In terms of building momentum for the future, expect to revisit this issue. This is not a one and done shot thing. We are not talking about a change in work hours. We are talking about racial issues, bias, prejudice, emotions. These things are fluid. They're ever changing. And you need to be planned for revisiting this and let your groups know that. We will be coming back to this quarterly for the foreseeable future. And just also be always prepared for other similar needs, whether it's a different group that feels that they aren't being treated with respect, or there's another issue that's going on in the world that requires this attention. This is an election year. There may be things that come up that end up tying to those anxieties people have of what's happening politically in our world. So being prepared for that is part of the after meeting context of what needs to happen. Therese, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yes, the other thing that I would add is there a way built into the process, a way that people can ask questions who may have been too shy to ask in the meeting? Is there a way that those questions and concerns can be, how will they be monitored and managed? The other thing is that invariably people leave a meeting like this really full and may very well have delayed thoughts. How will those be managed?
Very true. Very true. Okay, these are great points. And this is the bulk of our program information. We know that you probably have a lot of questions that have come up. A few of them have already been shot our way, so we will attend to those. And I want to say, although we're going to jump into the question and answer part in just a moment, I want to say that, you know, our team at Dynamic Team Solutions are poised, ready, and enthusiastically available to support you in your efforts. We will follow up with you after today's program with a list of resources that might be helpful for you to use, to share, and to guide your own efforts. But we also are available to do programs in-house and to support you in your efforts to continue this process forward. And we are just so pleased that you're a part of this plan today. For those of you who can't see this massive participant list, we have over 70 people that are on the call, and over 95% of those that registered for this call today, this webinar, joined us, which is amazing. It speaks to how important this issue is. I'm going to jump to the first question if I can. Oh, and I also received a question just about the slideshow. What will happen with this program afterward is we're recording it, and it will be shared on our website so that it can sustain there for long term, and we will provide you with a link to that after it is uploaded onto our site. So the first question that I received is, how do we facilitate these meetings if we need to do it in a virtual environment? Many of you are not going to be able to do these face-to-face. In fact, given what's happening in the world and with COVID-19, that is an expected thing. In fact, I think I'm going to put my video back on. Hello, everybody. Therese, if you want, you may do the same. And for just a minute, I'll stop the screen share so that we aren't distracted by that screen. But in terms of facilitating in a virtual environment, my thought is to make sure that the meetings are done in smaller groups so that you can actually have people with their videos on, you can see their faces, you can engage them in a way that they raise their hand and say, yeah, this is how I'm feeling. And it allows you to have that connection. And just, you know, much like everything else we're talking about, be really forthcoming. We wish we were in person to do this. This is exactly the kind of issue we'd like to handle in person. But here's where we are, and we can't, in a safe environment and as a responsible employer, ask you to come in person for this conversation. So we're doing it virtually. And then just be ultra engaging, be, you know, at your best. I would recommend as well keeping the groups to no more than 8 or 10 people. And if you're in a large company, let people choose which group they're in. Let them be with people they're most comfortable with. The important thing is engaging them, not forcing them to be with the people they necessarily work with. That can be helpful in certain capacities, but in others, it won't be as helpful. It may be more helpful for them to learn what are the rules for carrying things forward in a new positive way. Therese, did you have any added thoughts on it? Oh, I don't hear you. You might be muted.
And
there you are.
Okay. The only thing that I would say, as you move through the process, don't be surprised if people may ask if they can move to another group. And so I like the idea of having people start off in small groups, and also recognize that people may feel like, because don't be surprised if you end up with a group of people of all the same race, or people that are all the accountants in one group, or all the receptionists in one group. And so at some point, make sure that you offer people the option of mixing it up and moving to other groups, just so that they don't feel locked into the one group.
Great. Our next question is, if the discussion turns political, what is the best way to back out of it? Therese, why don't I let you grab that one first? I'm taking a hard pass on that one.
Just run out the door and say, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. No, if it does turn political, I think the only way that you can have that kind of discussion, and for me, I would be brave enough to facilitate that kind of discussion. And I would start with ground rules, and I would ask people, what ground rules do we need to have so that we can have this conversation? And also recognize if things get too heated, we get to pull the plug. We get to say, this is as far as we can go today. Recognizing that you may have to take incremental steps when you go into those very, very difficult conversations. But for me, I wouldn't be afraid of it. I would, if that's where they want to go, then I'm going to go with them and go as far as we can go, recognizing again that there may be limits as to how much and how far that conversation can go in one session.
I think that's really helpful.
If I could just tell you a quick story about my husband and his friend. He has a friend that was his college roommate, and they were roommates for 4 years. They've had a 50-year friendship, and believe it or not, they're on the opposite sides of most political issues. And so they have very, 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 very heated conversations. But one of the things that has saved them is that they realize that they do have some things in common. And if you can build on that, that can allow people to continue to have conversations. The other thing is they've realized that their 50-year friendship is more important than any disagreement that could come up. So sometimes people can wrap their minds around something like that and give them a reason to be able to, for example, we still have to work here together, so, and that's important. So how are we going to have this conversation so that when I come in tomorrow, we can still do that?
Yeah. And on that point, every one of us has people in our lives that are, strongly opinionated in something we disagree with, and we find a way of getting along with them and still caring about them. And so remembering that we sometimes do need to sort of pocket off a part of a person in order to maintain the relationship. And it might be important to do that. If it creates a conflict, a friction that interferes with work, it's not okay. That's not where it's appropriate to do that. But somebody's political ideations on the whole probably are not reason to, create a rift in the ways people work together and their abilities to collaborate. And where it does, it probably needs to be handled in a more private one-on-one setting to understand why those issues are so meaningful and so powerful, much to the point of the story Therese told about the woman who found the word Dalmatian so insulting and offensive. There may be things that need to be brought forward about why that matters and why it hurts and why it's important. So those are some other thoughts to bring up. I had another couple of questions. It was just very broad. What kind of questions should we ask in these meetings? And, for me, I think that was sort of what those slides represented, is to say, here's what we're doing as a company. Here's why we're doing it and what we care about and why it matters to us. What matters to you? Just really broad and open, was as your preparation to figure out the why and those pieces is going to help guide that. And you want your employees to know what the company cares about, what the individual leaders care about, and make them feel connected to that. It helps them to feel connected to the purpose, and then embrace what's important to them and allow that to be a fairly fluid point of conversation. I think is going to be really important. Okay. I had a question about some of the strategies that might be important in terms of rules, like what kind of rules are helpful for people to come up with so that they can have these conversations and they can be respectful. In fact, I got two questions that I think tie into that. Do you want to answer that one first, Therese, and I'll tag in with any other thoughts?
Okay. First of all, I think I kind of alluded to ground rules. And when I'm having those kind of difficult conversations, I will ask a group, What ground rules do we need to have in order to have a respectful conversation? And if no one raises their hand, which typically happens, I would say, can we all agree that if one person speaks at a time, that's going to allow us to hear what everyone says? And once you chime in with at least one suggestion, usually you'll get others. The other thing is that you want to make a decision as to how confidential this conversation needs to be. Does it go outside this room? Can we, the other thing is making sure that people feel safe enough to know that this is a no judgment zone. People are not going to be judged by the questions that they ask.
I think those are all really important, especially in the facilitative session, and to some extent those roll over to the day-to-day conversations. And I think the question that we got asked was more regarding the day-to-day, like after the facilitative session, what are some ground rules for people to be that respectful but nice? That was the context I was getting from the question. And my response to that, and I have a suggestion that comes up immediately to mind, is that no conversation is one way. If someone brings up something that they find offensive or something that's upsetting to them and they bring it to somebody else, that person is not only allowed but expected to respond. And it doesn't need to be, oh, I'm sorry. It might be, well, here's what I meant by that. And I didn't understand that was a problem. Help me to understand why it matters. It should always be a conversation. It should not be, a bullet to the heart and now we move forward. It should be very engaging and always, two or more ways, however many people are involved. I think too often people's resistance to conflict comes from their wanting to just be able to say what's on their mind and run away and have everybody respect them. And again, going back to that story Therese told, which is why it was such an impactful one, I thought, people don't know why something bothers you until you tell them. So it needs to be a conversation. They need to get clarity around it. They need to express their actually reaching an understanding in order for any change to be meaningful. So that's a rule that I think should always be a part of discussions that are heated, regardless of what they're about.
The other thing that I would remind people, and again, this is obvious, but it may not be obvious to you when you are in the heat of that moment, that conversation, and that is that there are always two sides to the pancake. And that's what I use, the conflict, I equate it to a pancake. There are always two sides to the pancake. No matter how flat it is, there's always two sides. And one of the things that I tell myself, I can't get into one of those difficult conversations if I'm not willing and able to listen to the other point of view. Because if I'm just ready to have a debate, then that's not the right time to enter a productive conversation.
Absolutely. And I had one of our guests on the program made the comment, validating what's been heard, even if it's not agreed upon, just validating, I hear you. And then maybe again, having the conversation, help me to understand where you're coming from. You don't have to agree with each other. You have to understand each other. And that's actually, like one of the core things that, Therese and I both firmly believe is that everybody doesn't need to agree, but when you feel understood, you can accept that somebody doesn't agree. The tension comes from feeling misunderstood, that you didn't know why that mattered, that you didn't know why it was important, and that's why you dismissed it. If you can convey and help people to convey and get to a place where they have understanding and then convey that they do to the person who needs to be understood, their acceptance of disagreement will be much, much more willing and more complete.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think it's helpful if you can find out the why behind the action or inaction. And so that's kind of what that's about. You may, because what may happen is you may both agree that no, that was wrong, that was inappropriate. But now that I know why it happened, at least I understand. Still may not agree, but at least I respectfully understand.
Yeah, I have one last question I think that's come up for the moment, unless others pop up while I'm talking. And it was, what do we do if someone's behavior seems to be more virtue signaling than authentic? How do we handle that? Do you want to take that one first, Therese? Or
Yes, I'll take that one. What I would say is I would ask that person, I would begin the conversation by saying, you know what, Joan, I'd like to have a conversation with you. It's a difficult conversation. I would like to be a mirror, and what I'm going to do is report back to you. I'm going to be that mirror, what it looks like I'm hearing and the message and the tone I'm getting from you. Granted, I may be all wrong, but do I have your permission to at least have that conversation? The reason I ask that question is because if you preface it with a question, then people are less likely to be defensive because they've given you permission to go there. So if they've given you permission to go there, it's a little bit more palatable, whatever and however you respond. Remember, always in responding, that you don't have to choose between being kind and being direct. I'm a firm believer that you can do both. You can be kind and direct.
That's a really helpful answer. I think that was our last question. There was some conversations that had happened between Therese and myself that maybe haven't been asked yet, but that might be in the backs of your minds, which are things like, what if the issues are personal in nature? What if it comes up that somebody's issues that are affecting them are more personal, but they keep coming up in the workplace? And how do you handle that? And I think that's a really valid question. And it happens because we do have that. My reaction to, when we were having that conversation, my response is that we always need to understand that if somebody's bringing it up in the workplace, it matters beyond the personal situation. So where you might have two employees that are on Facebook together and one said something that was deeply offensive to the other, you can't expect that it's going to be left at the door just because it was on Facebook and not a workplace issue. And so you need to handle it with the same level of concern and the same level of dedication to helping them reach a place of understanding and a place of acknowledgement of what is and isn't appropriate, not based on necessarily corporate standards that say it in a handbook, but based on human kindness and the desire to achieve a place where there's respect.
Yeah. I agree with everything that you said, Candace. Another thing that I have found that's helpful when people are in that spot is simply to recognize, as long as I'm doing it to you, it's okay. But if you ask me what it would look like and feel like if you did it to me, that can sometimes be an eye-opening moment. In other words, in mediation, that's called a role reversal. Sometimes people don't get it until they have to deal with how it would feel if it was being done to them. And that allows them to go, oh, now I get it.
Right. Right. All of these are important issues. As we're wrapping up, I'll bring us back to our closing screen because I think it's going to be helpful if anybody wanted to get our information on how to reach out. But I just want to thank everybody that's joined us for today's session. I hope this has been informative. I hope it has been engaging. Therese and I tried to make sure we did not practice or rehearse or think too hard on any of the things we wanted to share because we wanted it to feel as engaging live as it did when we were brainstorming about the importance of this issue. And your feedback will be important to us afterward. If you want to let us know what you thought, we'd certainly be interested in that input. If you want to reach out to us, our phone number is on the screen. Our URL for getting a direct session with us is also there. And I personally just want to thank you. It is so important to us that you as individuals feel the value of the time you give to us for something of this nature, and that we all share in the passion to bring positive change. And Therese, did you have any closing comments that you wanted to share? Did we lose you on mic? I don't hear you.
No, what happened was I was I was on mute. Just want to again compliment, and I want to mirror what we suggested. So we're at the end of our session, and I want to give gratitude for your presence, your attention, and certainly say to you good luck as you move forward. And as Candace has indicated, we are available if you need us.
Thank you very much, and continue to be as dynamic and fantastic as you are. Continue to move forward and create positive change for those around you. Have a wonderful day.